So check this out. Long before stories about Helen of Troy, before the tragedies of Clytemnestra, and even before the ruthless queen Cersei Lannister ever terrified TV audiences, there was another woman whose name made kings nervous. Her name was Medea. And here's the wild part. She wasn't remembered because she was the most beautiful woman in the world, or because she led armies into war, or because some prophecy said she'd change history. No, Medea became legendary because everyone who came close to her paid a price. Her father, her brother, her enemies, even the man she loved more than anything. This isn't some sweet myth about innocence or destiny. This is the kind of story that makes people uncomfortable, the kind historians whisper about and storytellers struggle to explain. Because Medea wasn't just a queen, she was a sorceress, a princess born from the bloodline of the sun god Helios. A woman who betrayed her own kingdom for love, helped a man steal the legendary Golden Fleece, and destroyed everything that stood between him and glory. But when that same man decided she was no longer useful, when he tried to replace her like she was nothing, that's when the real story began. Because Medea didn't beg, she didn't cry, she didn't disappear quietly into the shadows. She burned an entire kingdom to remind the world exactly who she was. And trust me, what she did next is the kind of revenge that still shocks people more than 2,000 years later. So the real question is, was Medea a monster, or was she simply a woman who refused to be forgotten?
So now that you know the kind of legend Medea would become, you've got to understand where her story really begins. Because Medea didn't grow up in the polished marble cities most Greek myths love to talk about. She was born far from places like Athens and the shining temples of Mount Olympus. Her home was Colchis, a kingdom sitting on the wild edge of the known world. To the Greeks, Colchis was mysterious, dangerous, the kind of place sailors talked about in quiet voices. Thick forests, jagged mountains, dark rivers cutting through the land. It wasn't the clean, orderly world the Greeks liked to imagine. But to Medea, it was simply home. Her father was Aeetes, the powerful king who ruled the land with a reputation that leaned much more toward cruelty than kindness. This was not a warm family palace full of laughter and music. This was a court built on power, fear, and ancient traditions. And then there was Medea's bloodline, because through her father, she carried the blood of Helios, the titan who drove the blazing chariot of the sun across the sky every single day. That meant Medea wasn't just royalty, she was part divine. And in the world of Greek myth, that kind of lineage never comes quietly. But Medea's real power didn't come from royal titles or divine ancestry. It came from knowledge, from the strange, ancient practices passed down through the women of Colchis, practices the Greeks later called pharmakia, the deep craft of herbs, poisons, healing, and magic drawn straight from the earth. While other princesses might have been trained in court manners or diplomacy, Medea learned something very different. She learned how plants breathed, how roots tangled beneath the soil like veins under skin. She could crush a flower into powder and know instantly whether it would heal a wound, cloud a mind, or quietly stop a man's heart. This wasn't flashy magic like the gods of Olympus throwing lightning bolts. Medea's power was slower, older, more patient, and that patience showed in her personality. Even as a young woman, Medea wasn't loud or reckless. She watched people carefully, listened more than she spoke. When someone talked, she didn't just hear the words, she studied the meaning behind them. And when she finally made a decision, she committed completely. If she chose loyalty, it was absolute. If she chose revenge, it was devastating. The Greeks who later described her always said the same thing about her presence. Medea was beautiful, sure, but not in the soft, comforting way their poets loved to praise. Her beauty was sharper, colder, dark hair falling in thick braids, eyes deep and intense, always watching, always calculating. When she walked into a room, people didn't just notice her. They felt something change. Not desire, not admiration, uncertainty. Because Medea didn't look through people, she looked into them. And there was always this quiet feeling that she understood far more than she let anyone see, which is exactly why what happened next would shock the entire world of Greek myth. Because one day, a ship arrived in Colchis, a ship carrying some of the most famous heroes of the ancient world. At its helm was a young man named Jason, sailing aboard the legendary ship Argo. And that single arrival was about to change Medea's life and the fate of entire kingdoms.
So when we left off, the quiet, calculating Princess Medea was living in the distant kingdom of Colchis, mastering ancient magic and watching the world with those sharp, unblinking eyes. And then, one day, the horizon changed. A ship appeared on the water. Not just any ship, the legendary Argo. On board were some of the greatest heroes of their age, warriors whose names would echo through myth for centuries, men like Heracles, the strongest man alive, and Orpheus, whose music could move even the stones. But the man leading them, the one who mattered most, was Jason. Jason hadn't come with an army. He hadn't come to conquer Colchis. He came for something far more dangerous. The legendary Golden Fleece. Now, this wasn't just some shiny treasure hanging in a palace vault. The Golden Fleece was sacred, a divine relic guarded by Medea's father, Aeetes. It hung from a tree deep in a sacred grove, watched day and night by a dragon that never slept. In other words, stealing it should have been impossible. But Jason walked straight into the king's court anyway. And here's the crazy part. He didn't beg, he didn't threaten, he simply stood there, calm and confident, and demanded the fleece like it was already his. King Aeetes, of course, had no intention of handing over something so sacred. But instead of refusing outright, he offered Jason a challenge, 3 trials so deadly no outsider had ever survived them. First, Jason would have to yoke a pair of fire-breathing bulls. Then, he'd use them to plow a field, and finally, he'd sow dragon's teeth into that soil, knowing that from those teeth would rise an army of deadly warriors. Survive all 3 tasks, Aeetes said, and the fleece would be his. Everyone in the court knew the truth. Jason wasn't meant to win. He was meant to die. But that's when something unexpected happened. Because as Jason stood there in the throne room, confident, ambitious, fearless, someone else was watching from the edge of the court. Medea. Some stories say it was love at first sight. Others say the gods themselves interfered, that Aphrodite struck Medea's heart with sudden passion at the request of Hera, because Jason would never succeed without her help. Maybe that's true, maybe it wasn't. But one thing is certain. When Medea looked at Jason, something inside her shifted. A woman who had always been careful, always patient, suddenly faced a choice that would change everything. Because helping this stranger wouldn't just be risky, it would mean betraying her father, her kingdom, and everything she had ever known. But Medea had one defining trait. When she chose someone, she chose completely. And what she decided to do for Jason next would prove just how dangerous that loyalty could be.